you so much for coming this morning, and I'm really honored and excited that we have with us today Dr. Scott Mitchell. I'll do an introduction of him very briefly, but yeah, he's a very busy man, and so I really appreciate the fact that he's taking time from his schedule to be with us today here in Salinas. And as you all know, this year is the 100th anniversary of the Salinas Buddhist Temple. This October we'll have a major celebration, but this event today was sort of help us kick off this year as the 100th anniversary. And it's for me, it's remarkable that we're able to get Scott Mitchell to be here to talk about American Buddhism. So, Dr. Scott Mitchell is the Dean of Students and Faculty Affairs at the Institute of Buddhist Studies in Berkeley. He has a certificate in Buddhist Studies. He's the director of the Certificate in Buddhist Studies program there. And he's been a faculty member of the IBS since 2008, and also part of the Graduate Theological Union community. His research interests include Buddhism in the Western context, Buddhist modernity, Pure Land Buddhism, translocal religions, ritual studies, and media studies. He has his BA from San Francisco State University, his master's degree from the Institute of Buddhist Studies and the GTU, and his PhD from the Graduate Theological Union. His research and teaching interests include Buddhism in Western contexts, Buddhist modernism, Pure Land Buddhism, post-colonial studies of religion, ritual studies, media studies, and his other publications besides the making of American Buddhism include Methods in Buddhist Studies, Buddhism in America, Global Religion, Buddhism Beyond Borders, New Perspectives on Buddhism in the United States, Drawing Blood, An Intersection of Knowledge, Economics, and Buddhist Economics, American Shin Buddhist Music, and Ritual Use of Music in U.S. Chodo Shin Shu Buddhist Communities, and also the Tranquil Mediator. Dr. Mitchell is the Dean of Students, as I mentioned, at the Institute of Buddhist Studies, but in July, he will change his hats, and he'll become the president of the Institute of Buddhist Studies. I don't know if he'll continue teaching, but I will. We'll find out. He does teach courses now on Buddhism in the West, Buddhism in film, history of Shin Buddhism, critical race theory, and American Buddhism. So since this is the beginning of the 100th anniversary of the Salinas Buddhist Temple, I just wanted to take a minute to share with you a brief history of the Salinas Buddhist Temple. And this is not just for your interest, but also for Dr. Mitchell. The history of what we know as the Buddhist Church of Salinas began on February 9, 2021. This is when a minister from Watsonville came to Salinas and was asked to perform services in a private home, the home of Mr. Yasaku Enna, a strawberry grower out in Oak Grove. I don't think there's Oak Grove anymore, is there? It's northeast of us, I believe.
Or the Posse Grounds. The Posse Grounds.
Okay, that's the Oak Grove area, I guess. It was. I understand it was the world's largest production of strawberries back then.
It was 200 acres. They had 40 families on 5 acres each.
Yeah. So that was 1921, and 3 years later, in response to Shin Buddhist gatherings growing up, that they established the Buddhist Church of Salinas on March 9, 1924, so 100 years ago. So a temporary church was established and services were held what is now East Market Street. And by October of that year, plans were underway to purchase and build a church. So 3 lots were purchased on this location that we're sitting now. And a groundbreaking ceremony was held, and the Monshu, Sonyu Otani, attended from Japan. So in the summer of 1926, the temple building was completed. On July 15, 1926, Reverend Hideo Shimakawa was assigned to Salinas as its first minister. And soon after that, 3 other ministers were appointed. So there was a total of 4 ministers here in Salinas. The temple was able to grow, including, with the 4 ministers, they had Sunday school, they had YBA, they had young men, young women's clubs, they had athletic programs, basketball, baseball, scout troop, and also the Japanese language school. In 1929, they purchased the adjacent lot and a YBA hall was built. And I think that was the original multi-purpose gymnasium. That was in 1929. So in 1934, the temple celebrated its 10th anniversary with the purchase of our bonsho, a large bell that is housed out here in the temple grounds. So in mid-October, the bell arrived from Japan, and there was a lot of fanfare with that arrival of the bell. There was a parade. The Monshu from Japan, Nenshi Shoujo Otani, officiated at an unveiling service. Fox Movies of Hollywood came and filmed the event. Many news outlets and reporters were on hand to see the unveiling of the bell. So the temple was growing. At its peak, it was over 250 families. So when we think about families, 250, that's probably 500 people plus their children, probably 700 to 800, maybe close to 1,000 people here in Salinas. Of course, then the outbreak of World War II changed that drastically. So there's a story about the Bonsho that I think some of you know, that before the war broke out, the military said that they couldn't ring the Bonsho, that they had to take it down because they were afraid that the Japanese here would signal Monterey Bay, Japanese coming into the bay and attacking the central coast. So they lowered the bell into the belfry, the lower part of the temple, of the bell tower, until after the war, during the war. So the Salinas Index Journal featured the news of the roundup on its front page of the New York Times, reported that raids by federal agents and police in Monterey Bay had resulted in the arrest of 38 people, including, according to the FBI agents, quote, their best catch, the black-belted Buddhist priest Tamanaka, who was thought to have been a police official in Tokyo. The Times also noted the seizure of large quantities of contraband material, such as fifth columnists might find useful. So Life magazine's article entitled U.S. Uproots Jap Aliens featured a photo of the Salinas Buddhist Temple bell platform, minus the gong. Some of you may be familiar with Reverend Fujimura. This is his book, Wet Sleeves. He chronicles his experience during his arrest by the FBI and his interrogation. And one kind of humorous thing that happened despite the tragedy of being arrested, he said he was accused of being a naval officer spy. And Reverend Fujimura's response was, how can a skinny person like myself be a Japanese naval officer? This is from Duncan Williams' book. The internment of Japanese residents was particularly difficult for the Salinas High School class of 1942. 46 seniors were unable to attend their own commencement ceremonies. 2 faculty members traveled across town to see that the seniors received their diplomas at the Assembly Center, which was the Salinas Fairgrounds. So one of the graduates later said it did not make up for being in prison. So post-war, Salinas had its share of racism and oppression with the returning Japanese. Many Salinas families had sons who were in the Bataan, part of the Death March, where the Japanese marched POWs for 500 miles with little food or water. Many died, many suffered lifelong injuries due to the march. So the Filipino community also felt animosity towards the Japanese due to the invasion of the Philippines. Dr. Tetsuden Kashima notes that after the war, the Buddhist Church of Salinas lost about 1/3 of its previous membership families, but it retained enough members to continue supporting one resident minister. So Reverend Fujimura, who was in Chicago, was asked to return to Salinas and be the resident minister here in Salinas. So in the mid-60s, then a new wave of immigration occurred, as many of you know. It came to Salinas and began a growing flower industry. And as the third generation of Japanese Americans continued to thrive with youth groups like the YBA, the influx of these new Issei, the Shin Issei, helped the temple grow and thrive. Through those years of growth, Reverend Iwai, who was here from 1972 to 75, played a pivotal role in the design and building of the present temple. His sudden death in 1975 brought Reverend Takamura, who was here from 76 to 95. And Reverend Takamura guided the temple's growth for the next 20 years. So as the Shin Issei established a thriving and growing flower business, mostly in the south end of Salinas, working hard day and night to make a living, Reverend Takamura drove a bus to their homes and shuttled the children to temple gatherings on Sunday mornings. So many changes have occurred since those early days, but Salinas has continued to provide a Dharma center for the Salinas Valley and surrounding area. And over the years, it has maintained a close working relationship with Monterey and Watsonville. As I mentioned, this year, the temple commemorates 100 years, and we're proud of the accomplishments and honored to be the caretakers of this temple. And we will continue to honor the founders and share the Nenbutsu teaching with all. So this is just a brief history of the Salinas Buddhist Temple. And I apologize for Dr. Mitchell for taking time away from him to talk about this. But I'd like to ask Dr. Mitchell, first of all, to read an opening reading from his book on page 144.
It should be clear that Japanese American Shin Buddhists have been instrumental in the making of American Buddhism. That is, whereas scholarly and popular treatments of American Buddhist history often foreground the accomplishments of white converts or overtly claim that American Buddhism begins with them, it is clear that the origins of American Buddhism are rightfully with the Issei and Issei Buddhists who self-consciously articulated and promoted a version of modern Buddhism that was their contribution to American society as part of the larger project of asserting their right to be fully accepted as Americans.
So I've asked Dr. Mitchell to read this particular section from his book, which is on 144, because I think it capsulizes, I think, a lot of what he lays out in the book, The Making of American Buddhism. So let's begin there. Dr. Mitchell, can you share with us some of these connections between Shin Buddhism and Buddhist modernists?
Sure. So the book is mostly, I focus a lot on the Berkeley Buddhist Temple, not just in the post-war years, but in the few years leading up to World War II. And one of the things that I'm interested in the book is the way in which people talk about American Buddhist history. There's these sort of grand narratives that we hear about in both the sort of academic study of American Buddhism, but also in the popular culture. And one of the aspects of that narrative is that there are a certain number of people who are chiefly responsible for popularizing Buddhism. Talking about the history of Salinas and the temple bell and the ministers being accused of being spies and police or whatever. I think that it's important to remember that prior to World War II, Buddhism was not accepted in America. It wasn't. It was considered a dangerous religion. It was one of the reasons why Japanese immigrants and their children were singled out and being suspected of being a danger to the country, was because they were Buddhists. They weren't Christian, right? So what's interesting though is that within 10 years or so after the end of World War II, Buddhism suddenly starts to become really popular. And it often, the reason people think that it becomes popular is because of a certain number of people that are often called Buddhist modernists. People like D.T. Suzuki, Alan Watts, the Beat poets, Jack Kerouac, all those guys. Suddenly, kind of out of nowhere, Buddhism starts to become really popular. As a historian, that's an interesting question. How do you go from this religion that's considered a dangerous threat and then really quickly become wildly popular? How does that happen? And so what I do in the book is I say, part of the reason why that happened was precisely because of Japanese Americans who were already practicing Buddhism here in America, were very, very deliberate about calling what they were doing American Buddhism, and sort of laying the foundation, laying the groundwork for a later generation of people to come and learn about Buddhism and then make it popular outside of the Japanese community.
Thank you. I might add that I found your book, The Making of American Buddhism, to be really important work for us as American Buddhists. Most of us are second or third generation, some fourth generation Japanese Americans or Buddhists living here in the United States. And so to be identified as an American Buddhist, I think your book does a great service to all of us. And I really appreciate your work on this book, Dr. Mitchell. And so can you give us a little bit of background on how you came into this project?
Yeah, I did all of my graduate work focused on American Buddhism generally, but also specifically on the history of BCA. And, I did a lot of work doing some of the historical work on the history of the Berkeley Temple, mostly just because I happened to be there. But I think that this particular project really got started because of Reverend David Matsumoto, who's the current president of IPS. He and I, years and years ago, before we were in our current positions at the Institute, we were both just teachers. And we struck up a conversation one day and decided to teach a class together. It was about sort of modern Jodo Shinshu, both in Japan and in the United States. And so at some point during the course of teaching that class, he took the class on a tour of the Berkeley Temple, sort of behind the scenes, and told us all these interesting stories about, sort of similar to the stories that you were saying about the Salinas Temple, just about the history of the Berkeley Temple. And part of that included a conversation about the Young Buddhist Association and this publication that they had produced that really had a sort of heyday in the 1950s. And it was called the Berkeley Busse. It was a magazine that was produced by the Young Buddhist Association. The first few issues actually came out before the war in the late 30s and early 40s. And then after the war, pretty quickly the YBA re-established itself in Berkeley and started producing this annual magazine, really. I'd heard about the Busse before, but as part of this tour that Reverend Matsumoto was giving us, he had a whole collection of them, almost an entire print run of the whole thing. And he had laid it out on one of the big tables in the social hall in Berkeley. And that was really the first time that I had seen these things in person. And there's a different experience when you just read about something, and then when you actually go there and actually see it or touch it, right? It's similar to like when you go to Japan, or it's like, oh, you get to go somewhere for the first time. So I got really excited about actually just sort of seeing these physical magazines, not just because of the fact that they exist, but that the content of them was so interesting. In the 1950s, like I said, there were all these connections in Berkeley between the Nisei community, the Young Buddhist Association, and the sort of literary pop culture and Beat generation writers that were also doing a lot of work at that time. And so in the Busse, you find poetry by Gary Snyder, Jack Kerouac, essays by Alan Watts, people that are sort of famous, right? And yet, here they are writing in this, sort of temple newsletter. And so I just find that really, really interesting. And over the next several years, Jordan Matsumoto and I would meet and talk about, ideas and work stuff. And every once in a while he'd say, you should really do some research on this. It's an interesting topic. And it took me a while before he realized he was like, no, you need to do this work. So I started back in, I think, 2017 or something, just really focusing on this slice of history, and read the entire print run of the Busse, and it's just really interesting because it's not just these famous beat poets and whatnot, but there's tons of material from Kamo and Jane Imamura, who were Reverend Imamura was the minister at the Berkeley Temple in the 1950s. Scholars from Japan would come visit, and they would have essays on the Busse as well, and a lot of Nisei writers as well. Kashiwagi, Hiroshi Kashiwagi is one of my favorite contributors to the Busse. It's just really interesting literature, and art, and poetry. So, and then the book.
Thank you. Yeah, I can't say enough how important I believe this book is for us as Jodo Shinshu Buddhists. And Dr. Mitchell talked about his book in Sacramento at the National Council meeting. And Dr. Miyagi was he was interviewing you about your book. And one of the first things that Dr. Miyagi said was, it made him mad because of the lack of acknowledgement of Shin Buddhists in America that contributed to what is now known as American Buddhism. And so I believe your book really does bring that out and helps us understand that our tradition had a deep influence on American Buddhism today. So earlier in your book, you cite the challenge of general Buddhism versus Jodo Shinshu being taught in the early days of the BCA. Were the early Jodo Shinshu priests having to do this to try to reach a larger audience? Or was it perhaps maybe a stepping stone from general Buddhism to Jodo Shinshu?
Yeah, I think it's both of those things. One of the things that I discovered in the research is that in the late 1800s, early 1900s, when a lot of the Jodo Shinshu priests were first coming to America, there was a lot of sort of intellectual interest in Buddhism on the part of European philosophers and whatnot. But a lot of people were more interested in Indian Buddhism and sort of the historical origins of Buddhism, and less interested in Japanese Buddhism. And so, as a response to that, there were a lot of people in Japan, a lot of intellectuals and priests who wanted to promote Japanese Buddhism and show how it was connected, how it related to Indian Buddhism. So I think that's part of it. It was part of this sort of like global movement to sort of put Japanese Buddhism on the same intellectual level as other European scholars. When priests came to America, though, I think that one of the things that occurred to me in the course of the research was there were very few translations of Buddhist texts in the early 20th century. And a lot of the translation work that had been done up to that point was from Pali or Sanskrit, not from Japanese. And so a colleague of mine, Jeff Wilson, who also writes about some of this stuff, pointed out that nobody had translated anything that Shinran wrote until the second half of the 20th century. So if you're a priest trying to talk about Jodo Shinshu in English, but you literally don't have the words to actually explain some of the philosophy because it hasn't yet been translated into English. And so I think as a result, a lot of people sort of fell back on sort of general Buddhism in order to share their Dharma in whatever way they could.
Yeah, in your book you note how Reverend Imamura, who became bishop in Hawaii, built what is now the head temple there in Honolulu. And if you've ever been there, it's very Indian.
Very Indian.
So do you think that was a response to that sort of trying to convey a more general Buddhist?
Yeah, there's another scholar named Richard Jaffe who has a book that came out a couple years ago, and he talks about how there was a big Indian turn in Japanese Buddhism more generally, and that temple in Honolulu, yeah, has a very Indian, it has like, sort of like Indian stupas on top of it. Jaffe has shown that there were similar buildings that were built in like Taiwan and other places where the Japanese Empire had, when they were expanding across Asia, oftentimes Buddhists would come as well, and they built temples, and there were several like Indian-style Japanese temples. So yeah, I think there was a sort of there was a moment in time, so to speak.
And by the way, if you have questions in the midst of all this discussion, please raise your hand or shout out. Okay? We want to be a dialogue here. Tom?
So on the point of the architecture, it reminds me of like a Tsukiji temple. Tsukiji. I mean, that's very Indian looking. That was built like in the Meiji period. I don't remember exactly when that was built.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
Yeah.
But it is very, the architecture is very Indian.
So Japan had kind of gone through that sort of trend.
Yeah.
As well.
Yeah.
Okay. There's a supposition that priests like Reverend Pratt, who was a Caucasian woman in Tacoma, and Imamura Sensei are Shin Buddhists. And so in your book you say this is what Shinshu looks like for them as they presented it. So in presenting Shin, do you feel they consciously thought about how to present Buddhism to an English-speaking audience? And did they adjust or maybe even couch a little bit of what they were saying and fit the American audience?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, and part of the reason this came up in the book for me was because I've read some scholarship that kind of dismisses some, particularly converts, but also people like Imamura, for sort of not being orthodox enough almost. They're not sort of presenting an orthodox position on what Go Shinshu is. And that's an interesting question, whether or not they're being orthodox. but to me, that's a question maybe that you can argue about. I think what the reality is that wherever Buddhism goes, and over time, it's constantly changing and evolving based on the time and the place. So to me, it makes sense that people would try to convey Buddhism in a way that makes sense at their particular time and place. I think we're still doing that now, and that's just the way that we have to do it in order to try to get the Dharma out, to how people understand it.
Yeah, that's, I think, Onan said Buddhism or Shinshu is like Okayu. It fits into whatever vessel you put it in.
Right.
It's not necessarily an orthodox sort of presentation, but it is able to develop or adapt itself to whatever time and place it finds itself in. Okay. During World War II, there were Buddhists who were defending Buddhism against anti-Japanese and anti-Buddhist sentiments. You cite two truths, I think from Imamura Sensei actually, the distinction between philosophy and religion, and Buddhist law and imperial law. Can you please talk about the differences and how Shin Buddhists straddle these two truths?
Yeah, so for some people, when we talk about the two truths in Buddhism, there's a much older concept of the two truths. I think it comes from the Garjuna, who talks about ultimate truth versus sort of mundane truth. There's the mundane world we live in, and then there's the ultimate truth of nirvana. Around the time of Renmyo, which was in 600 years ago, or thereabouts, Renmyo sort of revitalized the Jodo Shinshu tradition, and Jodo Shinshu started to become very, very popular. It was becoming a much larger organization, and there were some people in the government in Japan who were sort of threatened by this. And so Renmyo and some later teachers started to talk about this distinction between the Buddha Dharma, or the law of the Buddha, versus imperial law. And they would articulate this in the sense of, in your ordinary everyday life, you should follow imperial law. Outwardly, be a good citizen. Inwardly, follow the Buddha Dharma. Inwardly, follow, have faith in the teachings. So that's it's a really interesting area of research, but it's also really, really nerdy. Like it's the kind of thing that not a lot of people know about. It's not the thing that you learn first day. It's a pretty technical, very, very, very technical kind of conversation. So there's a very famous essay that was written by Yamyo Imamura in 1918, I think, where he talks about Buddhism and democracy. And he's doing it to sort of defend Buddhism against people who are in America who are sort of anti-Buddhist, anti-Japanese. And he makes reference to this, this very technical term of the two truths between, it doesn't quite use the word imperial law and dharma law, but it's the same basic idea. And he uses this to say, we can be good Buddhists and we can also be good Americans. So I think that there's sort of built into this idea, this way in which the tradition has this idea where, you can be a good Buddhist, you can follow the Buddha Dharma, and you can also, sort of be a good citizen. I think this is why I think it's kind of nerdy, right? Because you can really get into this and sort of debate these ideas and say, well, what does that mean? Are you just supposed to be a good citizen and never, question authority, or all those kinds of things? And what is that? What are the implications there? But I do think that there's something to be said about this idea of sort of straddling these two worlds, like you said, being able to say, we're gonna find a way to be, a part of this society while also holding true to a sort of higher principle.
Yeah, it can be a tricky
Yeah.
thing to straddle those both worlds. I know that even Buddha Sensei himself led sugarcane workers on strikes on Honolulu. So is that being a good citizen, or is that being true to his Buddhist feelings? I don't know. No one really knows, I don't think. But throughout our history, Buddhist monks in Vietnam, protested, and even here in the United States. So it's a difficult topic, maybe another book. Okay. I have so many questions. You can see my book. I've got this. But how much effect did World War II and the incarceration of Japanese and Japanese Americans have on the development of Shin Buddhism and its effect on American Buddhism?
I don't think you can understate the impact that World War II and the incarceration had on multiple levels. The organization that is the umbrella that we're all under, the Buddhist Churches of America, came into existence in the camps, right? And it got started primarily by Nisei. Nisei were very intent on creating an organization. If you look at the original bylaws for the DCA, they were, you know, you mentioned Kashima, who's written about this, and Kashima, Professor Kashima has talked about how, you know, there was a movement within the Nisei to sort of distance the BCA from Japan. I think in part to be more American. They chose the name Buddhist Churches of America so it would fit in with sort of normative American religious ideas. So you know, you can look at those kinds of examples as examples of the way in which these things have changed. What was interesting in reading the Busei, though, you can also see what struck me was really kind of go back to this straddling two worlds. That there was a deep pride almost on the part of a lot of Nisei Buddhists to really, you know, sort of claim a Buddhist identity and to really to not sort of shy away from that. And I think that there was probably a lot of tension within the broader Japanese American community, right, between folks who want to assimilate or to convert to Christianity, and then others who were like, no, we can be Buddhist. And this is something that Williams talks about in his American Sutra, about sort of holding America accountable to this ideal that we have of the separation of church and state, the ideal of religious freedom. You know, if you really believe in those things, then you can be Buddhist, right? And so I found a lot of that stuff in the Busei to be just really inspiring, the way in which people were really holding on to this Buddhist identity in a way, at a time when, you know, I think it would have been much easier to abandon that, right? And just, you know, given everything was going on.
I got that same sense as I was reading your book, and really inspired by a generation of young Buddhists who were writing the Busei. And it wasn't like just a newsletter that told about what's happening on Sunday or what's going on, but there were actual statements of declarations of being Shin Buddhist, and being proud of being Shin Buddhist. And that's part of being American. So that's great. So you know, on this idea of how it affected Shin Buddhism, on page 58 in your book, you discussed the effect of colonialism on Buddhism, and you mentioned the decreasing monastic authority due to colonialism. So my question: did this laicization, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, of the Sangha harm Shin Buddhism, or did it in fact play right into the idea of a more lay practice of Shin Buddhism?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think a little bit of both. You know, a lot of if you look at the sort of history of Buddhism more broadly, from the mid-1800s up until the mid-20th century, there's definitely a movement to, laicization is one term, a sort of displacement of authority away from sort of traditional authority figures. Where this shows up the most is in this idea that as an individual, I can read a book and learn about the Dharma, and I don't have to listen to you.
Nobody does that.
I don't have to, you know, trust the authority figure, whether it's a monk or a priest or whatnot. This also shows up in these mass meditation movements. You know, a lot of people are meditating all of a sudden, and you know, historically most Buddhists didn't meditate. Only a small number of highly advanced monks really took the time to do that. But in the sort of beginning of the 20th century, you have this time when people are teaching lay people how to meditate, which is a new thing. So I think some of this stuff helps Jodo Shinshu, but on the other hand, some of it doesn't, because whether it's a lay practice, there's also that sense of like undermining authority, right? Like as an individual, I can learn about Buddhism when I don't have to go to a traditional authority figure. And another way this sort of plays against Jodo Shinshu again is with this whole meditation thing, because Jodo Shinshu doesn't have a strong meditation practice in that way. When meditation becomes really popular, this is what we find today, right? Most people assume that they don't know anything about Buddhism, that the Buddhists meditate. And, you know, they come here and
What's going on?
they get confused. Which is a shame for a lot of reasons, obviously, but also I think, you know, I think there's an opportunity there to change that conversation, right? And to say, what is it that we do as Shin Buddhists, and how does that fit in with, you know, with your life? Because not everybody can meditate, not everybody wants to meditate, but they still want to get something out of the Dharma. They still want to have that experience of be transformed by it. And there are other ways that can happen.
There's a term that we hear often nowadays, which is the nightstand Buddhists, who, like you say, pick up a book and they read it and they say, oh yeah, it's very wonderful for my life now, I can live my life. But they're eliminating the teacher-student sort of relationship by doing that. So whether it's good or bad, I don't know, but it's many people are just nightstand Buddhists. Yeah. Okay, no questions so far? Yes?
I'm from Watsonville, and I was going to the Watsonville Buddhist Church, but I can tell you about Buddhism for me personally, that I think it has saved my family, because after the war, we didn't have any place to go. The government was not going to help us one bit, but our family went to the Buddhist church and they helped us, and that's why we have been flourishing. And I can say that attributes to all the Japanese here.
Thank you for sharing that.
Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. And sort of subtext or another thing that I'm interested in the book is just the fact that we have buildings actually really matters. You know, you were saying last night at dinner that, you know, that all the members' possessions were kept at the temple, right? When the Japanese lost everything during the wartime incarceration, because they had a place to keep the belongings, many people were able to recover some of that and rebuild after the war. You know, and it's not, it wasn't lost on me that I was writing this book mostly during COVID when we weren't allowed to go out. And being really disconnected from other people and just sort of being really appreciative of the fact that, you know, earlier generations literally built these buildings that allow for things to happen. It allows for people to come together. It allows for people to be saved in a very practical way. And in a Buddhist way.
Thank you for sharing that. Kind of staying on this theme of the religious realm as opposed to the secular realm, I guess you'd call it. There's also this idea of the temple here, but our members, if you walk into their homes, 99% of them will have an abutsudan in their home, and which is the domestic realm. And so, can you explain to us, and does Shin Buddhism as a lay religion where home practice is encouraged, does it help create this overlap with, you know, what's going on at home and what's going on here in the temple?
Yeah, you know, it's an interesting question, and I think this kind of goes back to the assumptions people make about what counts as religion. It reminds me of this survey that was done by an organization called the Pew Research Group. They do these surveys of Indians and whatever. And they did a survey of Asian American religion, and they wanted to gauge how religious Asian Americans are. And I think lots of questions were in the survey, but one question had to do with how often do you attend services at church or temple, and talking with some of my colleagues who sort of looked at those survey results, were like, well, that's an interesting question, but it has a certain assumption, right? It assumes that if you go to temple, you're more religious. You know, if you go to this place on Sunday morning, you have more faith, which cuts against thousands of years of Asian religious practice that happens at home, at the Buddhism, or you go to Thai restaurants and you'll see the altar often, right, in a Thai restaurant. You know, that's another way of expressing your faith or expressing your religious identity. And if you think about it, this idea that, I think this comes from, again, from like a Christian perspective, right? Like people will say, oh, that person's like an Easter Christian, right? Like they only go to church on Easter, right? Sort of assuming that they're not, deeply committed because they don't go to a building every, So I think that's an interesting observation, is to sort of remind us that religion and our faith, or how we practice Buddhism, happens in different ways in different places. It doesn't just happen, on Sunday morning. It can happen at home and in a different kind of way.
Okay. So, in your book, you talk about how Dr. D.T. Suzuki was treated, and also a woman named Mihoko Okamura, how they were treated by the media. And so can you share with everyone this, not only how they were treated, but their contribution to American Buddhism and their ties to Shinto?
Yeah, this is something I actually, I'm really indebted to another scholar named Jane Iwamura. Jane Iwamura is also a scholar of Buddhism, American Buddhism, and grew up in Southern California, in Jodo Shinshu communities. And she wrote this really interesting book about sort of media representations of Asian religious figures, and how those media representations sort of reflect pop cultural ideas about Asia and Asian religions and Asian persons. And she talks a lot about D.T. Suzuki, who in the 1950s, he had come to the U.S. Before the war, back to Japan, and came back to America in the 1950s, and sort of became a minor celebrity. They were, he was lecturing at like Columbia University and other places, and so like people were writing profiles about Suzuki in like the New Yorker and other magazines. Jane Iwamura notices, however, that they were also writing profiles of him in like fashion magazines. And one of the things that they would do is they would take pictures of Suzuki, and whenever they did, they would make sure that he was wearing sort of traditional Japanese robes, basically, to make him look more exotic, which is ironic for a lot of reasons, one of which is because Suzuki was well known for just sort of wearing a suit and pants. Like he rarely dressed up in a sort of Japanese costume kind of way. So there's this way in which the media at the time was sort of making him more exotic in order to make him more interesting. Meanwhile, where he was staying in New York at the time, he was staying with the Okamura family. And the Okamuras were, D.T. Suzuki was a Zen Buddhist, but the Okamuras were Jodo Shinshu. They were originally in California, and I can't remember which camp they were in, but after the war they moved to New York. And Mihoko Okamura, the daughter, became a sort of a personal assistant to D.C. Suzuki. But she was also a student of his. She also eventually became sort of a Zen teacher in her own right. So these magazine stories about D.T. Suzuki will describe Suzuki as this exotic Oriental figure who has all this, profound wisdom, and then they'll sort of dismiss Mihoko Okamura as almost too American, like she's sort of boring. And so, Jamie Lamora writes about this and sort of says this kind of encapsulates the problem with the way in which, particularly Japanese Americans in the post-war period, are being represented as both exotic, and mystical, but also, but if you're Japanese American, then you're sort of ignored and sort of pushed aside. What I wanted to do in the book was sort of lift up the Okamuras because they really took care of D.T. Suzuki. He was staying at their home. They would cook him, meals. They would carry him around. And what I point out is that, Suzuki probably wouldn't have been able to do a lot of what he did in the 1950s without help. He could speak English, but his English wasn't great. He was, a nerdy guy, all this up in his head, absent-minded professor kind of person, trying to figure out how to, live your life in the 1950s in America would have been really difficult if he hadn't had this help and this support. And so I think that labor, basically, of the Okamura family was really influential, was really important for helping Suzuki become this sort of minor celebrity. And I can find these stories across the country, across time. There's, again, we have buildings. So when folks come, we get picked up at the airport and we get taken out to dinner, and there's all this other stuff that happens that allows for discussion, for the Dharma to actually spread.
So there's other areas in which there are figures in our American Buddhist history that have been sort of ignored, and you specifically talk about some women. And so can you share with us the story of Mrs. Matsuda, and you mentioned Jane Imamura, and their connection? This is kind of taking us back to Berkeley and their contribution to American Buddhism.
Yeah, well, it also brings us back here because Shinobu Matsuda was an Issei, and she and her husband was a Joshi priest, and they were in Guadalupe, actually, not too far from here, right? And they, it's actually interesting. Shinobu Matsuda kept a sort of a diary, and I was rereading it as I was doing the research for this, and she actually talks about the Spanish influenza, the Spanish pandemic that happened, the flu pandemic in 19, something like that. And I'm reading this, and they used the Guadalupe temple as like a place for sick children to come because the hospitals were overwhelmed. I was like, oh, I'm reading about a pandemic during a pandemic. Really interesting. So the Matsudas were, a very, very active sort of family, and Jane, one of their daughters, was a prolific musician. She was like a natural talent. She was going to go to UC Berkeley to study music, and in that process, she was introduced to Kanbo Imamura, who was another Nisei Buddhist. And he had recently been assigned to the Berkeley Temple, and they quickly got married, and then like a month later they got, that's when Pearl Harbor happened, and they were shipped off to, gosh, I can't remember now, but as a result, she was never able to finish her degree at UC Berkeley. When they came back to Berkeley after the war, first they were in Los Angeles, they were at the Ascension Temple, they opened a hostel for Japanese Americans returning from the camps, then they came to Berkeley, kind of did the same thing. There was still a lot of anti-Japanese sentiment, even in liberal Berkeley, there was a lot of anti-Japanese sentiment. And so they opened a dormitory, and this was sort of how the Busei came into existence, because the Imamuras were just so active in trying to get, helping the young people really, learn about the Dharma and grow the community. By this time, Jane's father had passed away, and so Shinobu Matsuda was also living in Berkeley, and they started hosting these study classes. And the study classes were meant primarily, or at least initially, the study classes were meant to help young Nisei Buddhists learn about Buddhism so that they could become priests, so they could become ministers. There was no training program for that. At the time, all of the ministers who came from Japan. And there was this sense that the Nisei wanted to become, they wanted to become leaders in their own right, not just ministers, but, temple presidents and so on and so forth. The Imamura started these study groups kind of with that in mind, and the very first class was actually held in Shinobu Matsura's living room at her home. At these classes were people like Taitetsu Uno, Hiroshi Kashiwagi, a lot of really interesting people, but then also eventually, the deep poets start showing up. And why this matters to me so much is because, if it wasn't for Jane and her mother, those classes might not have gotten off the ground. And over time, those classes became recognized by the BCA, and they changed the name to the BCA Study Center at the Berkeley Temple. And then the BCA Study Center in the mid-1960s became the Institute of Buddhist Studies. So I often think about how if it hadn't been for this work that they did 75 years ago, on a wing and a prayer, as they say, right? They didn't have any money. Everything was by volunteer, just hope, basically. Then I wouldn't be here. I wouldn't be able to do what I do. So I just think that's really profound, really important.
Thank you. On a little side note, Reverend Imamura and Jane Imamura's children, Reverend Ryo Imamura became a minister and served in Hawaii for many years. Also opened up a counseling center with Reverend Imai in Berkeley, which was a Jodo Shinshu sort of based counseling service. And the daughter, Ray Imamura, became a classical pianist and is very well known. Yeah. So Jane's musical talent was transferred to all the children, because I remember Dio playing the guitar over a campfire. Very hippie-ish. Those were the days. Let's see. So much of your book discusses the contribution of the Berkeley Buddhist Temple. And by the way, I want to mention that I think Mrs. Matsura and Jane Imamura really encouraged the writers of the Busei and supported them. And so one of the things that you mentioned in your book is Hiroshi Kashiwagi's play, which is called The Seed of Kisabotama. And maybe one of the first English plays on Buddhism that was done. And so, but anyway, their contributions, including Reverend Imamura's creation of the dormitory for the students, and what is, as you mentioned in the beginning of IBS, you mentioned that there's a shared history of ongoing interconnection between communities of practice and scholarship. So that was really what was happening in Berkeley, I think, at the time. So can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Yeah, I've said a couple times, that there's been a lot of intellectual interest in Buddhism in Europe and North America for a couple hundred years. A lot of that interest is often done by sort of outsiders, right? It's like scholars who are sort of interested in the religion, but they're not actually practicing it. And so you have basically two communities. You have people who are committed Buddhists who are doing the work, and then you also have scholars who are sort of studying at a distance. And there's a way in which scholars can be full of themselves, I'll just say it, and sometimes sort of think that they know better, or they have a different perspective on things, and sort of actively try to keep the tradition at an arm's length. But the reality is that a lot of these scholars, these great, brilliant scholars, kind of get their start by actually practicing Buddhism, or at least being in conversation with Buddhists. And I found a lot of evidence of that in Berkeley. These study sessions were, the beat poets were coming, but so were, visiting scholars who were teaching at UC Berkeley or at Stanford. There was another thing that was happening at the time called the Association for Asian Studies, which got its start in San Francisco in the mid-1950s. Alan Watts was one of the first teachers at this institute. They were very interested in Asian religions, so there was a lot of overlap between these sort of scholars, but also Jodo Shinshu Buddhists. One story that I read about in the book concerns a scholar named Alex Wayman. Alex Wayman was, when I became a scholar, when I started doing my own graduate work, older scholars would say, Alex Wayman was this brilliant person, but he was also kind of prickly. He was kind of a difficult person to work with. And he went on to a career where he translated all of these sutras from Tibetan and Sanskrit, and just a well-known, very famous scholar. He's in the book because he, as a graduate student, was at UC Berkeley, and he was going to these study sessions, these study classes that were held at the Berkeley Temple, and I would talk to one of the Imamura children. She was like, "Oh yeah, I remember him. He was interesting." So there's these connections between Jodo Shinshu, priests and scholars, and scholars who are sort of trying to keep the tradition at arm's length, and they're not really acknowledging that relationship that I think continues to this day.
Thank you. So there is a plethora of people, not just Jodo Shinshu priests, but members, and there was also like Julius Goldwater, Reverend Pratt. By the way, Reverend Goldwater was in Los Angeles, Reverend Pratt was in Tacoma. There were several other Caucasian Jodo Shinshu priests that were working prior to World War II. And so their contribution also is something that you point out in the book. So you mentioned the Pew Institute earlier, and I read a study asking young Asian Americans, about their religious connection, and what is it that they feel is connection to Buddhism. And 90% of them talked about it's a cultural connection that they feel. So they didn't mention a religious connection as much as a cultural connection. So if we talk about our American culture, it's hard to define. I don't know how to define American culture because it's such a diverse country. So if young people are looking at it from the cultural aspect, how do they connect with Buddhism, especially in particular Jodo Shinshu Buddhism, and how does Jodo Shinshu Buddhism fit into this culture that is hard to define? Good answer. I don't know either.
Well, I think part of it is sometimes we're asking the wrong questions. Before I was saying, the Pew is trying to measure how religious you are by how often you go to church, which is not a bad question. It's just you're just going to get one kind of answer. I see these studies too, and people will talk about culture, and I don't really know what they mean by that, but I suspect that part of it has to do with a feeling of connection and community. And there have been some studies about young folks and their religious practices, and a lot of younger people are actually sort of yearning for a sense of community or a sense of connection to other people. They don't feel like they have that. And, you know, maybe we call that culture, but I think it's also just the sense of being able to be with other people. You know, one of the things that I think about every once in a while is, you know, we have the three treasures, the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. You know, we hardly ever talk about the Sangha, right? We always talk about the Dharma, we gotta spread the Dharma. But we do that because of the Sangha, like the Sangha makes that happen. And I think maybe that's part of the answer, right? Is to sort of think differently about how we're talking about what is culture. Because I don't know what that means either. But maybe it has to do with community and being able to be with people.
So I think people will understand that, you know, at Obon, as an example,
Yeah.
people consider that a cultural event or festival. And people will come out in droves to Obon, but they won't come to the services. You know? Right? So I think.
We have to have dancing at the service.
Yeah. And teriyaki chicken. Okay. I have more questions, but I want to give our audience a chance to ask questions of Dr. Mitchell. Yes, Carol?
I just have a question. I think you can hear me. You mentioned about scholars want to study Buddhism. I'm not a scholar, but I'm Buddhist because I tend it and I practice it. So, you know, the scholars who study it, write about it, are they Buddhist or they just study it and write about it? Do they practice it?
Depends. Some folks are, some scholars, you know, will identify as a Buddhist and do practice in addition to their scholarship. Others are very clear that they're not. They're not a practicing Buddhist. They're just interested in the study of religion. Yeah.
Well, I was going to say, you know, when I was in college, one of my friends, he was talking about, oh, he read this wonderful book, Siddhartha, and he thought it was wonderful. He thought it was fiction. So he's telling me all about it. Of course, I fill in the blanks. So he says, "Oh, did you read it?" I says, "No, that's my religion." He was shocked. So that's the kind of thing.
Yeah.
Kind of feeding off what Carol just said, so what's your position on that as a president of the Institute of Buddhist Study in Congress?
My position on.
Are you ordained, are you practicing Buddhist, or?
I'm not ordained, but I do consider myself a practicing Buddhist. Yeah. Firmly, proudly Jewish.
Anybody else? Questions? So, yeah, Tom.
So at the beginning, you know, I was at the BCA session, and I remember the Yaji Sensei says, "I'm angry," because we enabled, you know, like Zen and all this to happen, and then not only that, we don't get the credit, and the so-called American Buddhism is sort of made up to be that instead of us, right? I'm wondering, maybe it's that way because we're kind of associated with ethnic, cultural kind of practice, you know, and the general American public don't really care about that, or maybe it's not exotic enough to interest them, and maybe are we doing disservice to ourselves by being, you know, having to cater to the rituals and all this, you know, that is associated with Japanese ethnic, you know, practices. If we were kind of divorced from that, we had done better.
Well, I don't know. I think everything you said is right on. You know, that there's you know, yes, there's a tendency to say, you know, this is an ethnic religion and therefore it's not, you know, whatever. There's another line from Jane Iwamura's book is about how Alan Watts becomes sort of in the 1950s sort of becomes like the spokesperson for Zen and Asian religion. And she says, you know, this happened because there were actually a lot of people doing lots of stuff, and it's a very, very complicated story. And when you're writing something for Life magazine, you just make it simple, right? You just distill all of that complexity down to a simple narrative, and then that narrative gets picked up over and over and over again. And that's, I think, part of what happened. Is that, you know, a simple narrative comes out, and that simple narrative excludes, you know, a whole community of people, unfortunately. You know, could we have done something different? Sure, but I don't know what that would have been, and if that would have mattered. You know, I also think that, you know, I think part of the reason why Reverend Miyagi is mad, and rightfully so, is because part of the answer there is like, well, you know, do you have to give up the teriyaki chicken? Like, in order to be accepted, you have to give up your own, you know, your own identity. Like that doesn't seem right. That doesn't seem fair, right? So part of my sort of gut feeling to that question is, you know, no. like you know, like just be yourself, and don't feel like you have to change just because, you know, society asks you to. And I would also just point out that, you know, my friend and colleague Natalie Cooley, she gets this gets her blood going, because she'll say, you know, I'll paraphrase her. She'll say that all Buddhism is ethnic Buddhism, right? That all religion is ethnic religion. I mean, if you look at the history of American religion more generally, you know, there aren't, you know, white people churches. There are German churches and, you know, Norwegian churches and Italian churches, right? Those are different ethnicities. Somehow all of those become, you know, white spaces, but they all have a cultural background, right? So that's part of it, I think, where that anger comes from. Like, why do I have to give up, you know, why should you have to give up the teriyaki chicken and dancing at Oval just to be accepted? That doesn't seem right. You know, that's my personal response, not my academic response. But just to sort of rethink what we mean by ethnic and, you know, and culture. You know, everybody's got culture.
I recall early on in my ministry being told by some of my older ministers and mentors, you know, you never apologize for who you are and what you present to the audience. You know, it should be done from a point of pride and character. You know. So never apologize for being Buddhist or being Buddhist. So, and I think we do find that sort of watering down a little bit of what it means to be Jodo Shinshu. And so, you know, one of the questions I have for you is, you know, in your book, towards the end of the book, you ask the question, what if? You know, and could you share with us your thoughts on our present situation in the BCA and our temples? And have we, this sort of ties in with what Tom was saying, have we created a micro-utopia? And in doing so, have we limited ourselves in our presence in America?
Yeah, I mean, like we were talking about last night, you know, there's I think a fundamental, there's a sort of tension within the BCA and within the history of the community and, you know, the Imamuras really are a really good example of this. The Imamuras were very interested in doing outreach. Both Kamo Imamura and Berkeley, but also his father in Hawaii, they were, constantly trying to get people to come into the temple and being open, not just the Japanese community, but trying to bring people in. But it would be wrong to say that everybody was on board with that. even in Berkeley, right there, I would hear stories about people saying, the Imamura sometimes went too far, and they would have people come into the community, and it was like, well, we don't want them here, right? So I think that there's always that sort of balancing act of, we've created a community here for Japanese Americans. It's a safe space. We don't want just any random people coming in. This is our home kind of thing. That's one sort of extreme, and the other one is let's be totally open, water them down. It's not cultural, whatever you want to call it. So I think that sort of tension is always kind of present, and it goes back and forth. I think depending on where and when you are, right? Like Berkeley today is very open. It's a much different community than than other Jodo Shinshu communities. There's also there's the Tacoma Temple now that's almost entirely Caucasian, right? There's no Japanese families there at all anymore. So there's very different experiences even within the BCA. I kind of lost my train of thought. So anyway, I think, as for our present situation, I know that there's a lot of concern in the BCA in general about declining membership, and you said yourself, people come to Oblong, but they don't come on Sunday morning, and what does that mean? I don't want to say that we shouldn't worry about it, but I also want to point out that that's true across the board. Every religious institution in the United States has a membership problem. It's not just us. And I think that speaks to just people's changing attitudes about religion and what really matters. Again, I think that for younger generations, there is a desire to be part of a community, but I also think that younger generations don't think about joining things, like becoming members, in a way that even my generation did. That's the next thing to figure out, like how do you change the model, so to speak.
Any questions? Yes, Carol.
I have another one. Talked about assimilation in a lot of the BCA started off as mostly Japanese or Asian community, or however you want to call it, culture. But then now a lot of temples are getting non-Asians. And so then you have a lot of Caucasian or how do they assimilate into, I think most of them are in a large temple, but how do they assimilate? Are they assimilating completely, or within this organization, is that other group bringing in their own culture and it's a subculture or a subset or something, or are they actually assimilating?
That's probably all the above. Tacoma, for example, is predominantly. Spokane. Yeah. I'm sorry, Spokane. Spokane is predominantly white now. But I was just last week, I was, Mark Uno was at IBS, and he and I were talking, and he was invited to Spokane not too long ago, and they're still doing a lot of the same rituals and really sort of holding on to what you might call cultural kind of aspects of Jodo Shinshu. When I was at Denver last time, which is one of these big temples that I think is about 50-50 in terms of its membership, I don't know, it felt very Japanese to me. So I'm not sure what that means. But I also, this kind of goes back to that question of what do we mean by culture? And one of the interesting things that I read about in the book is that in the immediate post-war period, Japan is an occupied country, right? And the U.S. government is sending all kinds of people to Japan to rewrite their constitution and all this stuff. And a lot of Nisei go to Japan. And a lot of them go to Japan because they're explicitly hired by the U.S. government, because the U.S. government thinks because you're Japanese American, you'll naturally understand the culture of Japan, right? And so these Nisei, guys go to Japan and they hate it. And one of them, says that a Japanese person can spot a Nisei a mile away. Right? They don't feel like they fit in, right? So I think that's another part of this question. Like when we say, when we say that this place is Japanese, like is it? How much is this Japanese in the same way as it is in Japan? But there's a relationship there, obviously, right? There's some spectrum or continuity, but it's also different. And so I think that's also part of that question. Like, how does culture is constantly changing, and it's not a static thing. Yeah.
And I think that people come to the temple for different reasons. Some people come because they want to learn more about Buddhism. Some come because of the cultural aspects that sort of attract them. So, your question is, I think, an interesting one, but I think it's also that every person has a different reason for coming. Larry?
The theme of your book, American Buddhism, so what's your vision of American Buddhism? What do you hope?
I just hope we survive. It's been a hard couple of years, we're always within whatever kind of culture or historical period that we're in, and that to me is really the answer to that question. Where do I see American Buddhism heading in the future? I think that really depends on those big issues like climate change or who gets elected in November. How the culture changes around us is going to have an effect on how I think about again going back to Mrs. Matsuda. She's living through a pandemic, and if somebody had walked up to her and been like, how do you see Buddhism developing in America in the next 10, 20 years? Would she have said, oh well, Japan's going to attack Hawaii? Just like in the fall of 2019, I had a pretty clear plan about how I was going to write this book, and then that went out the window. Come February, right? So that's kind of it's a hard. I hope that we do good. I hope that we weather these storms. There's always that thing in the back of my mind of, wow, didn't see that coming.
How does Japan play into this whole, the Mother Temple play into this whole mix of things?
Oh yeah, that's a good question. I mean, what's happening in Japan is interesting, right? Because it's a rapidly aging population, and they have a lot of similar problems as a result of that, but it's going to be very different, right? Because one of the primary differences between America and Japan, of course, has to do with immigration policy. It's almost impossible to immigrate to Japan. So as that population gets older and there are fewer and fewer young people, that's gonna be a real big challenge. Yeah. And I don't know how that will affect sort of global Buddhist organizations like Community.
I was referring to American Buddhism also. Our founding temple, and not the control, but the relationship we have with it.
Yeah, I don't know. It'll be fine.
Maybe that's a question for the mission.
Is this live? Am I being, because what I say sometimes.
So I'm sort of, is there any
recently I visited a Vietnamese temple. And I was thinking, there's 2 million Vietnamese in the US apparently, and half of them are Buddhists. And they got 200 temples, something like that. They are the biggest Buddhist group in the US now, right? And you see news of attacks on their temple in Texas and things like that. There's a lot happening.
Yeah.
But they're incredibly ethnic. You go to their website, there's no English to be seen. All their practices is just very, very traditional. But they don't have what we got, like institutes and 125 years of history. And I just wonder, where they're headed. And then at the same time, I was thinking about Thich Nhat Hanh. He's a very famous Vietnamese Zen master. But it seems like he's kind of separate, huh? He's got his American followers, where are they headed? Is anybody study that?
Yeah, there's a book, I can't remember the scholar's name, but she wrote a book about Vietnamese Buddhism in the United States, which I'll admit I haven't read, so I can't vouch for the book necessarily, but some folks are interested in that question.
I mean, they're like kind of a mixture of Pure Land and Zen.
Yeah, I think, one of the things that is difficult about studying American Buddhism is that you really have to pay attention to, not just what's happening in America, but with like global history, because that has an impact. The reason that there are so many Vietnamese people in the United States, of course, is because of our failed war in Vietnam, right? And the refugee crisis that happened after that. When the Vietnamese refugees first came to the United States, the US government didn't want that refugee crisis to be a burden on any one city or state. So they actually made a law that each state had to absorb a certain number of refugees proportionate to their population size. This means that the Vietnamese refugees were spread out across the country in a way that's very different from Japanese history, right? Most Japanese immigrants in the late 1800s came to the West Coast. Most of them were in major cities or rural communities. For the Vietnamese experience, it's very, very different. I would say that probably slowed the development of Vietnamese American Buddhism because the community is really spread out. More recently, people were able to move after they were settled, and you see now sort of bigger pockets of Vietnamese communities in different parts of the country than you would have, 30, 40 years ago. So I think that's probably part of that story about, okay, this community is still, kind of in the same place that the VCA was, really early in its history, even though they've been here for several decades. Is part of it. Another part of it has to do with, because of the fall of Saigon, Buddhism was pretty much outlawed in Vietnam for a long time. More recently, the Vietnamese government has been trying to promote Buddhism, but they're trying to promote Buddhism and being, they have to be really careful about how they promote Buddhism because they have strong ties to China. So they can't, like, when Thich Nhat Hanh was still alive, they were pretty much sort of shunning him because he was pretty outspoken, against communism. He was a supporter of the Dalai Lama. So the Vietnamese government's like, yeah, we can't have this guy come back into the country. But so there's sort of global politics that get into play. But what that means is that a lot of the Vietnamese American communities don't have a connection to Vietnamese institutions in the same way that VCA has a connection to the home country. And I think that what that means is that then you have this this phenomenon that happens in immigrant religious communities where people try to basically recreate the homeland. They really want to preserve their cultural history, sort of in exile. There's a similar thing happened with a lot of Cuban refugees in Florida, Cuban Catholics who after Fidel Castro came to power, a lot of Cuban folks came to Florida, and you can find people sort of like really, really strong Cuban identity because they lost that and they can't go back, right? So there's these kinds of dynamics I think at play as well.
I mean, we Japanese before the war was sort of that way too.
Yeah.
Because we were being persecuted.
Well, I want to really thank Dr. Mitchell for taking time from his busy schedule as Dean of the Institute of Buddhist Studies to come and share with us this really remarkable and I think important book. I think each of you should read this book because it not only gives you a background on our Jodo Shinshu development of Buddhism in America, but how it contributed to what is American Buddhism. So it's really an important book, I believe. And I want to thank Dr. Mitchell for
Thank you.
really putting together a wonderful book for us. And commercial time. We have books here for sale that you can purchase through money.com. But in closing, I'm going to have Tom say a few words on behalf of the temple.
Yeah, so I like to, I read the book too, and I learned a lot about things that I didn't know about the past, the contribution of the essays before the war, and all the work that we say people went to do. And there's all these stories, particularly verbally, that I had no idea that was going on. And so highly recommend it. $30. We got 10 copies. 9 copies.
I'm sure.
And thank you very much for coming. And so I have a lot of food, way more than we could eat. We'll have it set up in the cafeteria, gym. So please stay on and we'll prepare.
Thank you. Please join me in Gasho. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu.
Thank you.